Have you ever had an idea so amazing that it could change the world? This podcast is called This Could Change Everything, and we're talking to people who are working on ideas that can do just that. I'm Joe Kim. I'm a professor in psychology, neuroscience, and behavior, and I've been at McMaster University for 15 years. One of the best parts of my job is learning about all the amazing research going on here. Today, we're learning how research on zebrafish could change how we think about antidepressants. Does that sound right?
Yeah, sounds pretty close.
So let's get started. Andrew, can you give us a brief introduction? Tell everyone who you are and what you're doing at Mac.
I'm Andrew Thompson. I'm a MITACS postdoctoral fellow with Dr. Joanna Wilson here at McMaster. I dabble a bit in teaching and occasionally do research, which is why I was hired.
Okay, well, let's jump right into your research. Give us a 1-minute elevator pitch on what you're doing with zebrafish.
I always view the zebrafish as a tool. It's a really well annotated tool. And we use this tool to ask the question, how have humans messed up the planet, where we have these anthropogenic impacts from our actions. And then we don't really know what the effects are on the biodiversity around us. So we use this animal to expose it to a lot of the contaminants and toxicants that we release into the environment. And we see can we gauge the effects? Can we gauge the impacts? And I use a lot of behavior as a tool of impact, but also look at the underpinnings of this behavioral change, looking at endocrine responses, which may be responsible for the effects that we see.
Okay, so humans, we are putting waste into our water supply.
Correct, every day.
And some of those are going to be directly impacting aquatic life. And one of these waste products that you're looking at are antidepressants.
Yes.
So tell me a bit about that.
We have a lot of antidepressants in our water. And one that is spiking, I would say, in recent years has been venlafaxine. It's a remarkably effective antidepressant where most people are very familiar with something like Prozac, which is fluoxetine, which is also a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Venlafaxine does serotonin and norepinephrine. This dual mechanism of action is really important, and that's why it's so effective, and that's why so many people use it. But what people don't really understand is when we take these drugs, we're kind of like a little furnace, but an inefficient furnace, where basically we take these drugs in, we undergo first pass metabolism, which degrades a majority of the drug, and still releases it in our excrement as its actual neuroactive form. So then it ends up in our wastewater, which it ends up in these ecosystems. And now we have to begin to ask the question, well, it's there. So what is it doing?
Okay, so antidepressants are getting into the water. Just how big a problem is it? How much is getting into the water?
The levels are actually quite staggering. And the problem is that they're increasing. And it is entirely district dependent. Like certain countries are really well equipped to deal with wastewater, and they clear out a majority of the compounds. They have better treatments. They have more expensive treatments of the water, and they can actually remove a high percentage of it. In other cases, it can be entirely site dependent, where if you look at places that are discharging near hospitals, you'll actually have an abundance of pharmaceuticals, particularly antidepressants, being released. And these levels, I remember that one of the running jokes for my entire doctorate was I made a slide when I first started, and it said the highest possible level was 1.0 micrograms a liter of venlafaxine. And throughout the duration of my doctorate, that number became erroneously false because it just continued to accumulate, and it just continued to rise in values. And something like a venlafaxine, which I'm sorry to be talking about it so much, is just something that I have the most experience with. Once the patent ran out on it, every generic company picked it up. And because of that, now it's everywhere.
Okay, but how about the aquatic life that lives in this water? What is the impact of the presence of these antidepressants on their lives?
That's where it gets really interesting, because you have to think we designed these drugs to work at really low levels for us. And these pills are designed to cause these behavioral changes for us to recapture ourselves when depression robs us of our energy and our mood. We take these pills to modulate our behavior. And then we put these drugs into the environment. And fish and aquatic life in general, the backbone of function, of behavior, of endocrinology, of life, is conserved. So the same systems that kind of govern us are present in these animals. And we're giving them the same thing that we give us to change us. And unsurprisingly, a lot of the results have kind of reflected that, where we actually do have the same types of changes happening. Where it becomes really interesting, and for us, and what had not really been explored a lot, was there are much more significant windows where an antidepressant can be much more impactful, particularly during development. So what we ended up doing was really targeting that early developmental window. And we really explicitly looked at one scenario, which was the maternal transfer. There was a few studies, one that I really love, for Grabakova 2014, love you. That was such a great study because what they were able to show is that it kind of accumulates in all the tissues. So you find the antidepressant in any tissue you look at. And we saw that it was actually accumulating in the reproductive tissue. So we kind of asked the question, well, if it's in the reproductive tissue, what would that mean for the offspring? And we replicated a maternal transfer scenario where we actually injected the drug. What's really interesting is that that injection at the earliest life stage, so right when they're laid, right when they're fertilized, the effects are lifelong. Not only the effects lifelong, at least what I've been able to show is they last for 3 generations. So not only are they affected when they become adults after being injected when they were an egg, they are also seen in their grandchildren. Similar effects. The similar systems are detrimentally impacted by one exposure from the drug, completely removed. They never saw it. They don't even know what it is. They've never seen the label. It is completely removed. But the effect, the systems are the same. So you see these, this is where the term epigenetics, the environmental implications really comes into play, where just because you've taken it once, your body has gotten rid of it. It's almost like it takes time. It takes generations for your body to actually get rid of the full impact, even though you've gotten rid of the drug, which I thought was really cool and terrifying for if you think of an environmental scenario.
So we have antidepressants in the water. This aquatic life is being constantly exposed to it. How could this change everything?
I mean, it could change everything because we have to be concerned with protecting the life around us. We have unfortunately kind of walked into the role as stewards for this planet. We are the overseers, the protectors, and it's our responsibility to look after the other species that share this earth with us. What we're unfortunately seeing globally is massive population declines in the biodiversity around us. People have suggested we're going through an extinction event, and there's very little evidence to suggest otherwise. And by no means am I saying that antidepressants being in the environment are causing this, but they're not helping. Because at least a lot of the evidence seems to suggest that they're hurting a lot of these aquatic animals rather than giving them a necessary boost.
So if you give me some context here, how big a deal is this problem? Is the level of concern that we might have for mercury levels accumulating, is that equivalent, or?
The problem is, and this is a critique of all my colleagues, is that all of us kind of look at one thing at a time. This is like a cocktail of antidepressants in the environment. But we exclusively, and I will say this openly, admitting that I've only done this, we look at one. And we look at one and we say, bad, this is bad, this is also bad. All of them are bad, but they're all together. So in terms of complexity, it's immense. But in terms of effects, it's unknown. There's enough science right now that supports that individual contaminants are a problem. What they are together could be a catastrophe.
So if consumption rates of antidepressants continue to rise, how will this impact these existing challenges faced by aquatic life?
I mean, it becomes a really complicated scenario because I talked about that cocktail of antidepressants. When you look at each of these, they kind of either do similar things or different things. Like if you look at like a male adult fish, like a goldfish, Jan Mennigan's group had basically shown that there in males specifically, you can have like an increase in estrogen, a decrease in testosterone, where other groups have demonstrated the exact opposite. And all of them have had some change in something like sperm quality and egg production and egg levels. So you have this like just think of reproduction that keeps these populations going. There's at least some evidence that these systems are at risk with exposures to antidepressants. And certain, there was Joanne Parrott's group with Environmental Climate Change in Canada. What they've been able to kind of show is that if you give them a lifelong exposure, it does affect the way that their organ systems develop, even at remarkably similar to environmental levels. So if you take all of the, when there's smoke, there's kind of like a fire, right? Where it, like, we can't explicitly say everything's over. This is the end of the world. This is the worst possible thing. But like each of these little things kind of ticking away at the foundation of life and the tools that life uses to propagate and functionally survive. That's where it becomes a bit scarier, because sure, no one has proof that this is the worst thing or that the animals are dying. We're far below anywhere close to what the toxic levels of these compounds are. But we don't need it to be toxic. We need it to be detrimental enough. And there's at least little bits of evidence that suggest it might be.
How have others in your field reacted to this research?
I would say ambivalence is probably because they're all showing the same kind of things. It's not like I'm really contrarian in terms of what I'm saying or what we're kind of seeing. One of the greatest feelings as a scientist is when someone else kind of publishes the same thing you do. And when you see all these groups from all around the world seeing the same trend. I showed when you inject this animal with this drug, you see this decrease in how much they move. That's just, it depresses them almost, where it causes this diminishment. And every other group, is, especially at higher levels of the drug, have seen that kind of effect. In any measurement of behavior that they've done, you've seen that same detriment. Because you really have to think, when we take these drugs, the people who take these are not healthy individuals usually. They're the people who need help, the people who want to recapture this energetic, this mood that depression has kind of robbed of them. So you take these drugs because you need them. These fish are not going to a psychiatrist because they need help. They're just trying to live their lives. They're fully healthy. And we're giving them these neuroactive drugs. And what the effect seems to be is that it's almost like a depression, where their movement is being diminished. And functionally, like, we're still trying to get the pieces, because there's one paper, I think it was like in 2021, that basically demonstrated at really low levels, it has this non-monotonic effect where it can actually increase their movement. But as you get higher, it starts to go down. So there's still a bit of things that have to be teased out. But the overarching theme in the literature seems to suggest that it lowers their movement, lowers their function, lowers this. And we'll see whether or not, when people do animals that are in these ecological scenarios, if we see a similar effect.
So is this human-introduced artificial stimulus, we might be inadvertently affecting their behavior and potentially the biodiversity of a species?
Yeah. I think the big idea and the kind of trying to push here is that we're not really alone. And every action that we have does have a consequence, whether it is medicating ourselves to get over, and necessarily medicating ourselves, there's going to be an inadvertent consequence. There's an environmental cost for us pursuing happiness. It's not selfish to say that you need these pills, but we do need to kind of realize that we have to supplement the environment in some way to mitigate any potential damages for taking these drugs. They are in our environment. There's at least enough evidence, in my mind, to say that the major systems that control and propagate animal viability are being impacted in some extent. And I've recently written a review paper on that, where the endocrine systems are, at environmental levels, manipulated in some way.
I love your passion and your commitment to your research, and trying to get others to learn about your research. Can you tell me about the moment you realized that your research was coming up with something pretty extraordinary?
Actually, probably when I wrote an op-ed about it, and a lot of people read it, and I got dozens of emails from people. There was and thank you to anyone who took the time to write to me. There were some people who actually wrote to me and just gave me all their comments without actually asking a question. Or I thought that was really unique, where people were really incensed enough that they had to reach out and almost vent. There was a gentleman who said, I noticed in the 80s and the 90s that the fish were different. The fish were messed up. And he was like, I knew they were doing something funky with the water. And I haven't forgotten that he just had this observation. He was like, it's just been too easy for me to fish. And I've always kind of like remembered that moment. But that's kind of where I started to realize that it may have been remotely when I published these papers, and in some cases you win awards, and then you publish something like an op-ed, and then it gets shared so many times, and people contact you like, oh, I read your thing in the newspaper. And you're like, oh, I didn't even know it was in the newspaper.
So more people will have read your op-ed than all of your research papers combined for the rest of your career.
100%. I remember I looked at one where I think before, maybe it just had reached over 1,000 views. And then I published the op-ed, and it shot up to over 10. And it was like a matter of days.
I think there's hundreds of thousands of people who have read that op-ed.
Yeah, and that's crazy. And I don't dare read it in case I made a typo. How embarrassing!
Well,
I've
read the op-ed. I really enjoy it. You really do outline the problem of the accumulation of antidepressants in our water. How do we begin to make things better?
I mean, the short answer to that is money. I think there's been enough research that has demonstrated that we can get rid of these antidepressants, but a lot of it is these tertiary treatments where we actually use chemicals to remove the chemicals in the water, because the primary and secondary ones, which a majority of wastewater treatment plants use globally, isn't really sufficient. And the chemicals themselves, whether it be ozonation or increased oxidation, cost money. And you also need the infrastructure to do that. And all of that together equates to a really big bill that I am unsure if governments are willing to kind of dish out to, because like that is fundamentally the solution. Like either we start asking people to take less pills, whether or not that's the best possible way to go about things, because some people do really need these pills, and it would be selfish for us to ask them to not, when this is the difference between them being here or not. So we kind of have to spend the money, whether it's increasing things like therapy. So maybe we don't always have to dish out the pill as the first line of treatment, and maybe talking to someone would be sufficient. Whether we remind people that they don't necessarily have to take the pill for the rest of their life, and it's just for the treatment of the depression, because that was the original purpose. It's kind of like an antibiotic. You take it until the symptoms go away. Those are all options, but I think the easiest one is to spend our way out of it and clean the water.
So you're saying you need more funding?
Yeah, I always need more funding, but I think that like globally we need more funding, because even let's say we fix issues in North America, that's not necessarily a way to fix the global issue. Like take Japan and Victoria's kerfuffle, where Victoria was just shunting wastewater into the water. They weren't treating it. And Japan got really mad. And it shows you how connected absolutely everything is, right? And I think that's the one thing that's kind of been forgotten, that we're all in this together. There's one planet. Mm-hmm. There's, 7, 8 odd billion of us, but we have to kind of work together.
It reminds me of that cartoon where people are in a boat and there's a hole in the boat. Yeah. And the people on one end think it's not my problem, but we're all in that same boat that's sinking.
Yeah. And it feels like it, and especially when, not to be doom and gloom, but if you actually do read the literature, it's very doom and gloom, where the levels of every contaminant are blowing up. And I know we're all concerned with our own individual exposures. Someone somewhere is getting exposed to something, whether it be another human or an animal. There's stuff accumulating everywhere. And I think everyone needs to just take a second and think about like the consistent use of things like plastics, the over medication. All of this is kind of equating to a huge problem that we're kind of just foregoing and punting along to the next generation.
Okay, Andrew, give me some hope for the future. How's the next step of your research journey going to help us?
I mean, hopefully I get a job. That would be nice, because then I could actually, like, what I kind of wanted to do was kind of establish this framework where here are the dosages of concern for each of these contaminants. There's thousands of chemicals that Canada currently doesn't have any environmental safety guidelines for. Thousands. We're just making it up as we go along, where it's honestly, it's just such an immense list. And in many cases, we don't actually have enough literature supporting it. But like my goal is, one, to develop these safety guidelines, but two, also develop tools that can help us screen like native species, particularly fish, because that's kind of been my bread and butter for my career. But where we can actually see, here's the level of concern. We're nearing it. What can we do? And I hope to use something like behavior and endocrinology as a readout of when we should be concerned for certain species, for their protection and survival.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for making us aware of your research.
Thank you for having me.
And I want to present to you this package of goldfish to thank you for
this is my favorite
being
flavor
on our show today. I'm Joe Kim. Thank you for listening.
This Could Change Everything is produced by the McCall MacBain Postdoctoral Fellows Teaching and Leadership Program here at McMaster University. Check the show notes for more information about our program and Andrew's research. Please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Happy researching!